January 8th, 1897. Inside the London offices of the Times, a newspaper article goes to print under a plain byline. The writer is Flora Shaw, the paper's colonial editor, and she's solving an administrative problem. The stretch of West Africa she's writing about is currently filed under a name nobody wants to put in a headline: the Royal Niger Company Territories. So she proposes something shorter, borrowed from the region's dominant river: Nigeria. It sticks. 17 years later, a British administrator stamps that name onto a newly combined colony of northern and southern Nigeria. His name is Frederick Lugard, and within 5 years of her coining the word, Flora Shaw becomes his wife. Nigeria wasn't empty land, waiting for a name in 1897 though. It already had names, plural, because Nigeria didn't replace one older nation. It replaced dozens of them. Walled kingdoms, trading empires, and city-states that were signing treaties with Portugal before England had a permanent navy. Nigeria isn't the exception, either. Ghana, Kenya, Zambia, pick almost any well-known country on the African continent, and the same pattern shows up. The name on today's map is recent. What it's sitting on top of is not. That gap matters for more than trivia night. A country's name is usually the first thing anyone learns about a place. And for most of Africa, that first thing was chosen, spelled, or mispronounced by someone who never lived there. None of what follows is guesswork. Every kingdom, ruler, and date in this video comes from documented sources: colonial correspondence, UNESCO heritage records, court chronicles, and archaeology pulled straight out of the ground. So here's what these 4 countries were actually called, and by whom, before anyone thousands of miles away ever got a vote on it. We're starting with the name that set the pattern. Start with what was standing on this land long before it had a European name. Starting around 500 BCE, a people archaeologists call the Nok culture were already smelting iron and shaping some of the oldest known figurative sculpture in sub-Saharan Africa, on the Yos Plateau in what's now central Nigeria. Their life-sized terracotta heads, with pierced, almond-shaped eyes, were only rediscovered a century ago during tin mining operations, and they're still not fully understood. Further south, the city of Ile-Ife had become the political and spiritual capital of the Yoruba people by around the 11th century, ruled by a king called the By the 12 and 1300s, Ife's bronze casters were producing some of the most naturalistic portrait heads anywhere in the medieval world. They were so lifelike that when a German explorer named Leo Frobenius encountered one in 1910, he refused to credit Yoruba artists with making it. He decided it had to be a relic of Atlantis, the lost civilization out of Plato's writings, because he couldn't accept that the people standing in front of him were capable of the art in front of him. Then there's the kingdom that gets left off most world history syllabuses entirely. Benin, not the modern country to the west, but the Benin Empire, ruled from Benin City by a king called the O. Under Oba Iwara, who took the throne in 1440, Benin City was rebuilt behind walls and moats so extensive that one 19th century visitor described them as several times longer than the Great Wall of China. Its bronze plaques recorded the reigns of its kings in detail most European courts of the same period weren't matching, and its Oba met Portuguese envoys as early as 1473, nearly 2 decades before Columbus reached the Caribbean. Benin was still fully independent 400 years later, in 1896, still setting its own terms on trade and government. Then it wasn't. In January 1897, a British official named James Phillips led an armed column toward Benin City against the Oba's explicit instructions to stay away during a religious festival. Benin's forces ambushed the column. Only 2 of the British party survived. London's answer was what it called a punitive expedition. 1,200 troops, arriving within weeks, burning Benin City to the ground, and shipping out thousands of its bronze and ivory artworks as spoils of war, many of which are still sitting in European museum collections today. The Oba was captured and exiled. That's the same year Flora Shaw was in her London office naming the whole territory Nigeria. Benin was only one kingdom among many, and time doesn't allow for all of them, but a few more are worth knowing. To the west, the Oyo Empire grew out of the same Yoruba tradition as Ife, founded according to tradition by a son of Oduduwa named Oranmiyan. By the 17 and 1800s, Oyo commanded enough cavalry and coastal trade to extend its influence as far as the kingdom of Dahomey, in what's now the Republic of Benin, to the west. To the north, the Sokoto Caliphate, founded in 1804 by a Fulani scholar named Usman Dan Fodio, grew into one of the largest states in 19th century Africa, governing under Islamic law from a capital that gave the caliphate its name. One of Usman Dan Fodio's daughters, Nana Asma'u, became a scholar and poet in her own right. Fluent in 4 languages, author of dozens of surviving works, and organizer of a network of women teachers that carried literacy into households across the caliphate for decades after her father's death. And further northeast, around Lake Chad, the Kanem-Bornu Empire had already been standing for roughly 1,000 years by the time the British arrived. One ruling line, in one form or another, outlasting almost any dynasty in recorded history anywhere on Earth. So when Flora Shaw picked a name for the stretch of West Africa that Britain's Royal Niger Company was expanding into, she wasn't naming empty geography. She was drawing a single administrative line around a 1,000-year-old empire on Lake Chad, a caliphate the size of a small continent, a walled kingdom with its own bronze casting guilds and dozens of other societies that had never shared a government, a religion, or even a language. One word. Whatever era each of those societies actually belonged to disappeared under the paperwork. That's what's sitting under Nigeria's name. Ghana's story is stranger, because the kingdom Ghana chose to name itself after was never actually there. Ghana's name change runs in the opposite direction from Nigeria's. Nobody in London chose it. On March 6, 1957, when the colony known as the Gold Coast became the first sub-Saharan African territory to win independence from Britain, its new Prime Minister, Kwame Nkrumah, picked the replacement name himself, Ghana. Gold Coast itself had been handed down by Portuguese traders in the 1470s, who found so much gold changing hands along that stretch of coastline that they built a fortress at Elmina just to secure it. The name described what could be extracted, not who lived there. Dutch, British, Danish, and Swedish traders followed the Portuguese in, running competing forts along the same coast for gold, timber, and, increasingly, enslaved people. By 1874, Britain had folded the whole region into a single colony under that same extraction-based name. So when independence came, Nkrumah wanted something that pointed backward instead of forward. A name that reached past nearly 5 centuries of European trading posts toward an African past worth being proud of. He landed on Ghana after the medieval Ghana Empire, a legendary trading state that had controlled a huge share of the West African gold trade for centuries. But there's a catch. That empire was never anywhere near the country, now named after it. The real Ghana Empire, which its own people called Wagadu, sat roughly 500 miles to the northwest, in what's now southern Mauritania and western Mali, nowhere close to the Gulf of Guinea coastline. It grew rich from around the 8th century onward by taxing gold and salt caravans crossing the Sahara, and Arab geographers wrote about it as a fabled land, where the king reportedly kept every gold nugget above a certain size for himself. Ghana wasn't even the empire's own name for its land. It was the king's title, something close to warrior ruler, which Arab traders picked up and used to refer to the kingdom as a whole. The empire declined through the 11th century and was absorbed into the Mali Empire by around 1240, 300 years before a single Portuguese ship ever reached the coastline that would eventually borrow its name. And Nkrumah knew all of this. The choice was symbolic on purpose. A newly independent country reaching for the grandest, most storied African name it could find, regardless of whether the geography lined up. It worked. Within a decade, more than 30 African nations had followed Ghana into independence. Centuries before any of this, though, something else stood on the land that is now Ghana. The Asante Empire, founded in the 1670s by a chief named Osei Tutu. Asante unified a cluster of Akan-speaking states around the city of Kumasi, bound together, according to Asante tradition, by a golden stool that a priest named Akomfo Anokye called down from the sky, said to carry the soul of the Asante nation inside it. Osei Tutu's successors grew Asante into the dominant power of the region, trading gold and, for a period, enslaved people for European firearms, and fighting the British to a standstill more than once. The last of those wars, in 1900, is remembered as the War of the Golden Stool. A British governor demanded the stool as a trophy of submission, and a queen mother from the district of Ajisu, named Ye Asantewa, raised an army rather than hand it over. She lost. Britain annexed Asante as a crown colony in 1902, but the Golden Stool itself was never surrendered. It's still the ceremonial seat of the Asante king today, in Kumasi, inside the same country now legally called Ghana. So modern Ghana borrowed its name from an empire that stood 500 miles away and had already been gone for 700 years, while the empire that actually ruled that exact ground barely gets a mention in the name at all. Kenya's story flips this a second time, because the landmark Kenya is named for really was standing right there. The complication is everything that surrounded it. Kenya's name really does come from something standing exactly where the modern border says. Mount Kenya, Africa's second highest peak, a dormant volcano capped in ice just a few miles south of the equator, has been known by closely related names among the peoples who've lived in its shadow for centuries. The Kikuyu called it Kirinyaga, generally translated as the Mountain of Whiteness, for the glacier visible at its summit. The Kamba and Embu used close variations on the same word. In December 1849, a German missionary named Johann Ludwig Krapf became the first European to lay eyes on it. Guided there by local communities who told him what they called it, Krapf recorded the name in his notes as Kenya. When the British eventually built an administrative territory around the mountain, officials never quite managed to pronounce Kirinyaga correctly, and the mangled version stuck. The territory was called the East Africa Protectorate, starting in 1895, then renamed Kenya Colony in 1920. Borrowed directly from a mountain most of the colonial officials back in London had never seen. So far, that's a story with the same shape as Nigeria's, a European mishearing turning permanent. But Kenya's pre-colonial history breaks the pattern the other three countries follow, and it's worth being honest about how, rather than forcing a tidy kingdom into a place that never had one. Start with the coast. For over 1,000 years before Krapf ever saw the mountain, a string of independent, wealthy city-states had been trading up and down what's now Kenya's coastline. Mombasa, Malindi, Lamu, each ruled by its own sultan, none of them answering to the others, all of them plugged into Indian Ocean trade routes, stretching to Arabia, Persia, India, and China. Their builders raised mosques and multi-story houses out of coral stone centuries before a single European trading company existed. Vasco da Gama's fleet reached Mombasa in 1498, and the Portuguese spent much of the next 2 centuries fighting the Swahili city-states for control of that trade, building a stone fort in the process. By the 1830s, control had passed to Sayyid Said, the Sultan of Oman, who conquered Mombasa in 1837 and 3 years later moved his entire capital from Muscat to the island of Zanzibar, turning a Persian Gulf Sultanate into an East African trading empire and putting the Kenyan coast under Omani rule decades before Britain ever arrived. When the British finally drew Kenya's colonial borders, the 10-mile coastal strip was, on paper, still leased from that same Sultan's successors, administered as a technically separate protectorate right up until independence, because that stretch of coast had never belonged to the inland territory in the first place. Move inland, though, and the story changes completely. The Kikuyu, now Kenya's largest ethnic group, never had a king. Neither did the Kalenjin communities of the Rift Valley or the Maasai further south. Political authority ran through councils of elders and age-set systems. Decisions made collectively, generation by generation, with no single throne anywhere in the territory. That's not a gap in the record. There wasn't a king to find. Because Kenya was never one society to begin with. It was a coastline of trading sultanates and an interior of dozens of self-governing communities, stitched together for the first time by a colonial border drawn around a mountain that none of those communities had agreed to share a country over, which makes Kenya the odd one out on this list. Not because its history runs thinner than Nigeria's, Ghana's, or Zambia's, but because it never had the one convenient, centralized kingdom that makes for a tidy before and after story. Zambia, by contrast, still has one, and unlike Ghana's borrowed empire, this one never left. Zambia's naming story covers the shortest distance between old and new of all four, because the name comes from a river that was never going anywhere. On October 24th, 1964, the territory called Northern Rhodesia became independent under its first president, Kenneth Kaunda. Northern Rhodesia's name had honoured Cecil Rhodes, the British mining magnate whose British South Africa Company claimed administrative control over the region in the 1890s. Rhodes never set foot in the territory that carried his name, and Britain's colonial office had already taken over direct administration from his company by 1924. Kaunda's government dropped Rhodes' name entirely and replaced it with Zambia, a shortened form of the Zambezi River, the waterway that has shaped the region's geography for as long as anyone's lived along it. In the Tonga language, spoken by communities along its upper reaches, the river's name is generally translated as something close to the Great River. That's a clean, deliberate reversal, trading a colonizer's surname for a landmark that had always belonged to the people living on it. Even Zambia's most famous natural site carries the same pattern in miniature. The waterfall that European maps call Victoria Falls has an older name that never went anywhere either. Communities along the Zambezi called it Mosi Oa Tunya, the smoke that thunders, long before the Scottish missionary David Livingstone renamed it after his queen in 1855. UNESCO now lists the site under both names side by side. But unlike Ghana's borrowed empire, Zambia's pre-colonial history isn't a separate story, bolted on for symbolism. Some of it is standing on almost exactly the same ground today. Along the upper Zambezi floodplain, in western Zambia, sits the Lozi Kingdom, also called Barotseland, ruled since at least the 17th century by a monarch called the Litunga. Its founding line migrated into the region from further north, and the kingdom organised itself around the yearly flooding of the Zambezi Plain. When the water rises each year, the Litunga still relocates from his dry season palace at Leilui to higher ground at Limulunga, in a ceremony called the Kwamboka, paddled across the floodplain in a large painted barge, while drummers and singers travel alongside. It isn't staged for tourists. The Barotse royal establishment still governs internal Lodzi affairs today, inside modern Zambia, and the Kwamboka still happens most years, roughly the way it has for generations. Further north and east, a second kingdom took shape the way many of the region's ruling lines did. Through migration out of the Luba heartland, in what's now the Democratic Republic of Congo, sometime in the 16 or 1700s. The Bemba, now Zambia's largest ethnic group, traced their royal line to a paramount chief, called the Chitimukulu. Bemba oral tradition frames the founding as a legend involving a fractured royal family and a crocodile clan. The kind of origin story historians read as a symbolic charter for the ruling line, not a literal record. What's documented with more confidence is the result. A centralized chieftaincy that expanded across northern Zambia through the 1800s, whose paramount chief still holds the title today. So of these four countries, Zambia ends up the most direct. A colonizer's name traded for a river's name, sitting on top of kingdoms that never stopped existing in the first place, whose kings can still be found governing, in ceremony at least, on the same land their ancestors ruled centuries before Northern Rhodesia was ever drawn on a map. 4 countries, 4 names, dating from 1897 to 1964. Every one of them newer than most people assume. And underneath every one of them, a history that was already old when the new name arrived. A walled empire that outsiders once compared in scale to the Great Wall of China. A caliphate the size of a small continent. A trading empire so tied to gold that a country 500 miles away chose to borrow its name centuries after it was gone. A mountain whose real name got mangled in translation, sitting above a coastline of sultanates, and an interior that never needed a king to stay organized. A river that gave its name to a nation, flowing past a kingdom that never stopped ruling itself. None of this makes the modern countries less real, or their names somehow illegitimate. Nigerians, Ghanaians, Kenyans, and Zambians built those identities themselves, through independence movements, constitutions, and generations of people who now call those names home on their own terms. But a name is only ever the newest layer. Scrape at it a little, and there's almost always an older one underneath. One with its own kings, its own art, and its own reasons for existing, that had nothing to do with whichever European trader, missionary, or journalist happened to write it down first. That's true almost everywhere, not just in Africa. Most countries carry a name that was chosen by somebody at some point for reasons that had more to do with the namer than the named. Africa's case just happens to be recent enough and documented well enough that you can still trace the whole exchange, what got replaced, when it happened, and who was doing the replacing. Most of these countries chose their names on purpose, at independence, as a first act of self-definition. So the point here was never that the modern names should change. It's that the name taught in a textbook is not the whole history of the place. Nigeria is Benin and Sokoto, and Kanem-Bornu and Nok. Ghana is Asante, standing on ground its own name doesn't mention. Kenya is a coastline of sultanates and an interior that organized itself without a single throne. Zambia is a river, and a floodplain kingdom whose ruler still crosses it by barge every year. If older names and vanished kingdoms are the kind of thing that pulls you in, that's what we do every week. The empires that got compressed into a single line on a modern map. Subscribe, and we'll keep going, one country at a time.